What if everything you thought you knew about the Black Death in London was only part of the story? Welcome to Jaden's History. I'm Jaden, and today I'll guide you through the haunting years of 1348 to 1350, when London stood on the brink of collapse. The images in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. If you value honest, deeply researched history, please consider subscribing for future episodes. I hope this journey offers you reflection, perspective, and a quiet moment to pause with the past. In the autumn of 1348, the plague reached London at a moment when the city was already strained to its limits. Medieval London was crowded, noisy, and unsanitary, with an estimated population between 70 and 100,000 people packed inside and just beyond its old Roman walls. Houses leaned over narrow lanes. Waste flowed through open gutters. Clean water was limited. It was a city built for trade and survival, not for disease control. Londoners did not face the outbreak in ignorance. News had already traveled from continental Europe. Merchants and sailors brought terrifying reports from Florence, where chroniclers recorded that as many as 60% of the population had died. These were not distant rumors. They were warnings carried along the same trade routes that connected London to the wider world. People understood that something catastrophic was moving toward them, even if they did not understand what it was. As deaths began to mount in 1348, city authorities responded in the only way they could. They established an emergency burial ground at East Smithfield, just outside the city walls. The site was consecrated so that the dead could rest in holy ground, a crucial concern in a deeply religious society. Graves were dug in long, organized trenches as the scale of mortality quickly overwhelmed parish churchyards. Between 1348 and 1350, London lost nearly half of its population. Streets that had once been crowded fell quiet. Workshops closed. Families vanished from tax rolls and parish records. This was not a gradual decline, but a sudden rupture in the life of the city. London did not simply endure a disease. It stood on the edge of collapse. For generations, many of us were taught a simple explanation for the Black Death. Rats carried infected fleas. The fleas bit humans. The disease spread slowly from port to port. That version of the story is not entirely wrong, but modern research suggests it is incomplete, especially when we look closely at what happened in London between 1348 and 1350. When historians and scientists map the speed at which the plague moved across England, a problem appears. The outbreak advanced far more quickly than rat populations alone could realistically account for. The timeline suggests transmission that did not rely only on rodents traveling from place to place. This has led researchers to examine another form of the disease caused by the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis. In its pneumonic form, plague infects the lungs. Unlike the bubonic form, which is typically transmitted through flea bites, pneumonic plague can spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. In crowded medieval streets, workshops, and homes, this would have transformed everyday contact into a serious risk. In that scenario, infection could pass through close conversation, shared indoor air, or caring for the sick. Each breath carried danger in a way that earlier generations did not fully understand. There is another important factor. Studies modeling transmission patterns suggest that human parasites such as fleas and lice living in clothing and bedding may have played a central role. In a densely populated city like London, where washing was limited and garments were rarely changed, these parasites could move easily from one person to another. This helps explain why the disease spread so explosively in tightly packed neighborhoods. For many viewers, this represents a major shift in understanding. The Black Death in London was not just a story about rats in the shadows. It may also have been a story about proximity, shared air, and the hidden ecology of the human body itself. To understand the scale of the catastrophe in London between 1348 and 1350, we have to look closely at what the disease actually did to the human body. Contemporary descriptions and later medical analysis paint a grim picture. Victims often developed a sudden and violent fever. Weakness followed quickly. Many suffered persistent vomiting. In cases believed to involve the pneumonic form, patients coughed blood as the infection overwhelmed their lungs. Death could come within days. One of the most recognizable signs was the appearance of swollen lymph nodes, commonly in the groin, armpit, or neck. These painful swellings, later called buboes, could darken as tissue damage progressed. It is from these blackened swellings that the term Black Death eventually emerged. For medieval Londoners, who had no knowledge of bacteria, these visible symptoms must have seemed terrifying and inexplicable. Yet, when we turn to the archaeological evidence at East Smithfield, a more complex picture emerges. Excavations of this emergency cemetery reveal that the dead were not simply thrown into pits in chaotic disorder. The bodies were laid in organized rows, often carefully arranged. This suggests that even at the height of mortality, civic and religious structures continued to function. The burial ground was consecrated, which mattered deeply in a Christian society that believed salvation was tied to sacred space. Authorities attempted to ensure that those who died in overwhelming numbers were still buried in holy ground. In the midst of fear and suffering, there was still an effort to preserve dignity, faith, and order. Perhaps the most important truth to understand about the Black Death in London between 1348 and 1350 is this: it was not an equal killer. For centuries, the pandemic has often been described as a force that struck everyone without distinction. Modern bioarchaeology tells a more complicated and unsettling story. Decades before the plague arrived, England had already endured severe hardship. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 devastated harvests across the country and is estimated to have caused the deaths of around 15% of the population. For those who survived, the consequences did not simply disappear when crops recovered. A generation of children grew up with chronic malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and repeated bouts of illness. By the time the plague reached London, many bodies were already carrying the scars of long-term deprivation. Excavations of plague cemeteries, including East Smithfield, have allowed researchers to examine skeletal remains in detail. Studies led by bioarchaeologists such as Sharon de Witter show consistent patterns. Individuals who died during the Black Death were often shorter on average, a marker associated with poor nutrition during childhood. Many skeletons display linear enamel hypoplasia, visible grooves in tooth enamel that form when a child experiences serious physiological stress, including hunger or disease. These markers tell us that vulnerability began early in life. Mortality patterns reinforce this picture. Historical and demographic analyses suggest that while roughly 27% of wealthy landowners in England died during the outbreak, mortality among poorer labourers and tenants may have ranged from 40 to 70% in some areas. The differences were not random. They reflect unequal access to food, cleaner living conditions, and overall resilience. This evidence challenges the idea of the plague as a universal leveler. Instead, it appears to have followed the existing fault lines of society. Poverty did not cause the bacterium, but it shaped who was most likely to succumb. When we look back at London in these years, we are not just seeing a biological disaster, we are seeing how inequality, already embedded in daily life, became a matter of survival and death. As mortality rose in London between 1348 and 1350, the strain was not only physical, the social fabric itself began to fray. In a deeply religious society, many people interpreted the plague as a punishment from God. Without knowledge of bacteria or transmission, suffering demanded a moral explanation. Sermons called for repentance. Public fear blended with spiritual anxiety. When death seemed everywhere, faith and fear became tightly intertwined. Across Europe during 1348 and 1349, this fear turned outward with tragic consequences. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through sorcery. These accusations led to waves of persecution and massacres in several regions. While the situation in London differed from parts of continental Europe, the broader pattern reveals how quickly panic could transform into violence when people searched for someone to blame. It is an uncomfortable reminder that epidemics often expose darker impulses alongside human resilience. Inside households, trust also broke down. Some contemporary accounts from Europe describe parents abandoning sick children and spouses, separating from one another out of terror of infection. The belief in corrupted air, often called miasma, shaped behavior. If disease traveled through poisonous vapors, then avoiding the breath of the sick felt like an act of survival. Medical responses reflected the limits of medieval knowledge. Physicians recommended the use of vinegar, aromatic herbs, and smoke to cleanse the air. People burned fires indoors or carried scented items in the hope of warding off contamination. These measures were rooted in the best understanding available at the time. Yet they could not stop a bacterial disease no one could see. In London, as elsewhere, medicine struggled while society grappled with fear. One of the most remarkable developments in recent decades comes from genetic science. By extracting ancient DNA from the teeth of individuals buried in 14th century cemeteries in Central Asia, particularly in present-day Kyrgyzstan, researchers have been able to trace the evolutionary history of Yersinia pestis with far greater precision. Teeth preserve genetic material well, allowing scientists to identify specific strains of the bacterium. These analyses revealed what some researchers describe as a major diversification event in the bacterium's history, sometimes referred to as a Big Bang moment. This genetic branching appears to have occurred only a few years before the plague spread into Europe. The strain that devastated London between 1348 and 1350 belongs to a lineage that descends directly from this Central Asian outbreak. For us today, this evidence is powerful. It confirms that the catastrophe in London was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a wider, interconnected world. Trade routes, migration, and long-distance exchange linked Central Asia to Europe. The Black Death was global in origin, long before globalization became a modern term. Science now allows us to see that connection, written in the DNA of the pathogen itself. When the worst wave of mortality subsided around 1350, London was not the same city. The demographic shock that began in 1348 reshaped everyday life in ways that were immediate and visible. With such a large portion of the population gone, there was a severe shortage of labor. Workshops, farms supplying the city, and construction projects all struggled to find workers. For survivors, this created new leverage. Wages began to rise because employers needed hands more than ever before. In some cases, property belonging to those who had died was divided among heirs or returned to the market. Land that once seemed unattainable could now change hands. For a brief period, the balance between rich and poor shifted. Inequality appeared to narrow, not because of reform, but because of loss. Yet this shift did not go unchallenged. The ruling classes reacted quickly. In England, measures such as the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. Authorities attempted to prevent labourers from using scarcity to demand better pay. Legal and economic tools were deployed to stabilise elite interests. What we see in the years after 1350 is not the disappearance of inequality, but its reorganisation. The trauma of the Black Death opened a window for change, but power structures adapted. For those of us looking back today, this is a sobering reminder. Even after a catastrophe that erased nearly half of London's people, social hierarchies did not simply dissolve. They evolved. The Black Death was never just a story about rats. It was a story about a bacterium that evolved, spread between people, and moved faster than anyone in the 14th century could understand. It exposed the deep social inequalities of medieval London, where the poor died in greater numbers because many were already weakened by hunger and hardship. In my view, this is the hardest truth. Pandemics are not equal forces. They magnify the cracks already present in society. The visuals in this video were created with artificial intelligence to help bring the history to life more clearly. I would truly value your thoughts, so please share them in the comments and consider subscribing to Jaden's History for more honest conversations about the past.